Pay attention to and note Reverend Cave's comments. In 1911, not quite 50 years after Thornwell's words, Cave says, as if the war's history is now written. So within the lifetimes of surviving Southern veterans, Thornwell's prophecy had been confirmed. It is now not quite 100 years after Cave had his Defense of the South published, and things have grown much worse. And now, not just about the South's history, but the whole of the historical realm. This is what Clyde Wilson, emeritus professor in history at the University of South Carolina, says in one of a collection of his essays titled Recovering Southern History, written in 1982, included in a volume named Defending Dixie, in which he discusses how this country was refounded by the result of the Northern victory. Quote, by a refounding, I mean the actual destruction or suppression of old views and their replacement by others, newly manufactured for social purposes rather than as a consequence of new knowledge. This means that history has to be written to establish the new regime as the only legitimate possibility within the accepted social symbols. And this is what was long ago generally diagnosed as Whig history, the assumption the good guys always win. The losers must not only lose, they must be misrepresented as well. A true history is interested in making something of the past as a whole that will be both true and useful. Perhaps we now face the inevitable distortions of our Civil War refounding, which prevents us from seeing the truth. That refounding necessarily involved a shift from tradition to ideology, and from history as a search for antecedents to history as an unfinished agenda, i.e., from things as they were to things as one might have wished them to be, from the living community and its real experiences to a hypothetical community and its fictitious past. But this alteration in American history does not result from new knowledge. It involves rather a reformulation of America, and therefore what American history includes. There is a vast difference between the writing of an American history that is a synthesis and the modern distortion. The second refounding is inextricably bound up with the Marxist elan which has pervaded a good part of the professional historical community. This is the critical problem in the survival of history, of memory, as discipline. Most certainly, American historical writing is, on the whole, growing more and more alienated from American culture. I do not think the average bright student of today can easily identify with his textbook. And I do not think that if the man in the street can identify with his history as it is being commonly presented to him, it will in any way make him a more earnest or happier citizen. Close quote. But what is that ideology of which Professor Wilson speaks? To begin to name and place that ideology, I would ask you to recall how we began with the words of California Supreme Court Justice Brown. But Brown doesn't go far back enough in time to find the locus of all this transmutation of which he speaks. To go far back enough, one must remember the origin of the term the left. The term originated to describe those opposed to the ancient regime in pre-revolutionary France, who sat on the left of the crown seat in the French National Assembly. The natural rights philosophy of that left, invented by certain of the Enlightenment philosophers in June of 1792, helped tear France apart through violent radical upheaval as a result of the agitation from those holding that philosophy. The left, as France's monarchy moved toward its extinction, eventually came to be dominated by a group called the Jacobins. As soon as they gained control, they established something called the Committee for Public Safety, composed of 12 members, but led by one Maximilien Robespierre. Robespierre was a disciple of a philosopher named Jean-Jacques Rousseau, as were many of those seeking to end the existence of the French monarchy. Indeed, Rousseau has been called the father of the French Revolution. This is what an internet encyclopedia source says about Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was one of the most influential thinkers during the Enlightenment in 18th century Europe. His works caused great controversy in France. Rousseau greatly impacted the late 18th century's Romantic naturalism movement, and his political ideals were championed by leaders of the French Revolution. And what were those ideals? Its tenets were that human societies up to that point had caged humanity through the cooperation of kings and priests and had to be overthrown. A new type of society was to be created, a social utopia at the point of the sword as necessary, and ruled by those who understood, technocrats properly educated about, how humanity should live. Any who oppose that agenda are the enemies of human progress and must be eliminated. As such, it was the enemy of religious traditions and all then existing traditional governments. Or as Robespierre proclaimed in his statement on the Republic of Virtue, subdue the enemies of liberty through terror, and you will be right as founders of the Republic. The government of revolution is the despotism of liberty against tyranny. And as an aside, this sentiment is the root of why one of the offshoots of this agenda, called Marxism, talks about the revolution in permanence. It is also why, over particularly the last century, we've seen enormous slaughters in the name of eliminating those who would stand in the way of such perfections. What I just shared is why Reverend Thornwell, who was quoted a moment ago, said in 1850 to a congregation in Charleston, South Carolina, that the parties in this conflict are not merely abolitionists and slaveholders. They are atheists, socialists, communists, red Republicans, Jacobins on the one side, and the friends of order and regulated freedom on the other. In one word, the world is the battleground, Christianity and atheism, the combatants, and the progress of humanity, the stake. But the left's agenda has a very different view of progress than did men like Thornwell. To continue the attempt to search out the nature and source of that agenda, it must be remarked that Rousseau himself had been influenced by the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes wrote the Leviathan in 1651, and that title and the opposition to the sentiments expressed in that work is why so many, such as Justice Brown, now call the federal government Leviathan, in which Hobbes posited the idea that humans and the dog-eat-dog of nature had to create a sovereign who could protect the weaker dogs from the stronger. Karl Marx remarked of Hobbes that he was the father of us all, meaning political speculators. The combination of such ideals, in short, were those meant to end evil in the world, at least as the Jacobins defined that evil, and eventually came to be called Jacobinism. The Jacobins' ideals were embodied in the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, dating the Jacobins' rise to power by just a few years. With that ethic, it should be no surprise that nearly immediately after its formation, the Committee on Public Safety began what has come to be called the Terror, a wave of assassinations, executions, and murders, which ultimately consumed its own when Robespierre himself was executed on 28 July 1794, little more than a year after the rampage had begun. The result of a rise of this radical revolutionary mindset, with great irony, has simply been a return to a modern form of paganism. To understand why I assert such, one must remember the nature of what the French revolutionaries were fighting when they opposed that cooperation of kings and priests. The old order the French Revolution sought to overthrow was invented in Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, around 6,000 years ago, and is why so often one hears in political literature of prior eras the mention of Oriental tyrants and despots, whether named Sargon or Saddam. That early version lasted from roughly 4000 BC until the Middle Ages, and one might call it conservatism with a capital C. Prior to the Middle Ages, the ancient world's religion, its Gnosticism, their sense of the order of things, was founded on mystical belief structures that found God in nature, in the elemental forces of the cosmos, which was the ground of the idea that the world is really an illusion. These forces, unless properly appeased, tended toward chaos, then a reversion to animal existence, and then to an end to the human dream. To assure the reversion to chaos would not occur,